Hello, it's Lawrence Romanowski from Calgary, Canada and Soleil EV magazine. The link to this EV buyer's guide is below, so please click on it. This video series is meant to complement the buyer's guide and shed some light on the new language that we're using for EVs, how to compare an EV to another EV and how that compares to an ICE vehicle. And much of that is getting our head around terminology, which is different from an electric vehicle than it is from a combustion engine. So let's just talk about power. Won't get too much into this, but we're used to talking about power as in horsepower, torque and horsepower. And this is, the horsepower is probably a couple hundred years old. It started when the industrial machines started to take over from horses, and they wanted a measure of the work a horse could do as it applied to a machine, so the machine could do so many times the work of a horse, etc. And they defined that as lifting 550 pounds 1 foot in 1 second, and that was for a horse. Okay, when it came to an internal combustion engine, the principles of power and work, of a force over a certain amount of time being equal to work, that was applied to the internal combustion engine. And as you know, internal combustion engines have reciprocating pistons. They act on a big crankshaft that spins. Okay, the twisting force of the crankshaft is torque. Okay, that's what you feel in the back of your seat when you accelerate. And the torque, as it's applied over many revolutions over time, is the power. That's why horsepower equals the torque times the revolutions. And that's why when a car is on a dynameter, it measures the torque and computes the horsepower by how fast it's going. Okay, so that's the origins of horsepower and torque. And for an internal combustion engine, because there's so many varieties of it, we have different engine sizes, different engine configurations. We have flat engines and V engines. We have horizontally like opposed engines. We have different cylinder heads. We have multi-valve engines. We have turbochargers, superchargers, you name it. It's incredibly diverse in terms of the way different engines are constructed. They each have their own torque curves. They produce the power in different ways throughout the rev range from 0 to 7,000 or 8,000. They produce their power at different amounts. There's a lot to compare different combustion engines with one another in terms of smoothness, in terms of reliability, in terms of how linear the power delivery is. And then combined with that, you've got the gearbox, and there's many different kinds of gearboxes, and they can be matched either successfully or unsuccessfully with the power output of the engine. So the engine gearbox from the internal combustion engine can be very complicated. There's a lot to compare, and it's kept automotive writers busy for years debating the merits of various configurations. Well, now we move to an electric motor, and none of that really applies. First of all, they don't have transmissions, or vast majority of them don't. They produce maximum torque at 0 RPM. The torques are mostly flat. They drop off a bit, but they're mostly flat. The differences between one electric motor and the other aren't very much. There might be subtle differences in the way they evacuate heat. There might be some differences in ultimate reliability, but really there's not much in it. There's not much in the placement of the electric motors because they're going to be in line with the axles. There's not much in the design of the powertrain of an EV because it's going to have the battery pack in the center on the floor with either two-wheel drive and one motor, or four-wheel drive and two motors, or possibly you can get a motor on each wheel. Okay, so there's some differences, but the vast majority of EVs that are going to be sold in quantity are going to be an EV with a battery between the axles, either one motor, two motor, two-wheel drive or four-wheel drive, batteries from 60 kilowatt hours to 100 kilowatt hours, and that's it. There's not much to compare with these cars, okay? So when we talk about power with these motors, the power, an electric motor, generally we talk about the power in kilowatts, just the same as we talk about the power in a light bulb being 100 watts. We talk about the power of an electric motor being 100 kilowatts or 125 kilowatts or 150 kilowatts. Okay, and that's one motor. Obviously, if you have two of them, you have double the amount of power. So the horsepower was relevant to a combustion engine in that you could take the twisting force or the torque times the revs and develop a meaningful number. But with the electric motor, it's less relevant, and horsepower doesn't really mean that much anymore. So I would encourage you to just discard horsepower. A horse, by definition, it's 0.745 of a horsepower. So a 100 horsepower engine would be 74.5 kilowatts. Okay, so kilowatt is 0.745 of a horsepower. A 400 horsepower engine would be 300 kilowatts. Okay, so, but I would encourage you to forget about the horsepower and just think about the kilowatts, because everything else is in kilowatts. You buy your power from the utility in kilowatt hours. You put it in the car through the plug in so many kilowatts. You store it in the battery in kilowatt hours. Your consumption is in kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers. So why not just keep the power in kilowatts? Okay, so that would mean that if you have, I mean, let's say you have a 100 kilowatt motor and you've got a 100 kilowatt hour battery. Well, your motor would produce 100 kilowatts for 1 hour. Okay, so if you've got a 200 kilowatt motor and a 100 kilowatt battery, your battery can produce 200 kilowatts for half an hour. Okay, so it just makes it a lot easier to think about the power that you take from the grid, the power that you pipe into the car, the expenditure of the same power when the car drives. Okay, it's all in kilowatts. So I would encourage everybody to just start thinking in kilowatts. Now, in the whole lineup of EVs that we see, probably the smallest one would be about 100 kilowatt. That would be about the smallest EV. And then we get up to, for the regular production cars, about 300 kilowatts. 300 kilowatts, 400 horsepower if you need to convert it. If you stick that in a 5,000 pound SUV, you've got 0 to 100 in around 5 seconds. Absolutely plenty fast for anything you ever need it to do. There's no reason anybody needs more than 300 kilowatts for any sort of passenger car. You can get it, but you don't need it. That's a fast car at 300 kilowatts. So most of the electric cars are going to be 150, 200, 250, 300 kilowatts. Most of them will have a rear wheel drive or front wheel drive option, one motor, which might be 150 kilowatts, or then you can get two motors and all wheel drive and 250 or 300 kilowatts. Okay, so the bigger dual motor all wheel drive vehicles will normally come with a bigger battery, and they'll have a little bit more frictional losses, and their consumption will be a little bit less. They'll weigh a little bit more, and they'll have to, tote around an extra engine or an extra motor and extra battery capacity. Okay, so I hope that kind of makes clear what a kilowatt is, and instead of trying to convert it to a horsepower, let's just try to keep it all in kilowatts. Let's try to keep the consumption in kilowatts. And now we've got something that's starting to make sense for most people. We buy it in kilowatt hours. We stick it in the car based on how many kilowatts we can pump in the car. We store the energy in the car in kilowatt hours. Our consumption is kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers. And the engine, if we need to, can produce up to 200 or 300 kilowatts at maximum RPM. It'll also tell you at the maximum power how much range you have too, but nobody's going to do that. Okay, so I hope that helps with kilowatts and with power and comparing EVs to the internal combustion car. Okay, thank you very much. For the next video, let's talk about the most complicated one, which is charging the car AC and DC.